Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Rational Standard. I am Martin van Staden, and today is a very special episode. I am joined, as usual, by Dr. Morné Malan. David Ansara is back, and we have a very special guest, Nicholas Woode-Smith, and he is joining us on the occasion of the formal relaunch of the Rational Standard. Some of you will recall the Rational Standard from many years prior. It never closed down, but it did go into a period of relative inactivity. But we were founded in 2015. That's 10 years ago, I guess, almost to the date, under a different name, but it quickly became the Rational Standard. And we thought at the Free Market Foundation that it was necessary for there to be a, a new voice, I guess, in the South African press landscape. And the Rational Standard was, at the time when it was founded, the only really explicitly liberal or classical liberal and libertarian platform for dissenting views from what at that time really was a developing consensus, very much around critical social justice, particularly as a result of the Fees Must Fall movement. And the landscape is not quite as limited today. We have many new dissenting voices around, and that's obviously a good thing. But given how this year has started, I think in many of our views, with the press really getting it wrong, to put it lightly, we decided it's important to have this additional voice rejuvenated and back on the scene. So yeah, without further ado, let's welcome Nicholas to this show and give him an opportunity to maybe lead us in about what Rational Standard was, and what the context of the time was when we established it.
Thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be back. So, for those who don't know, I'm the managing editor of the Rational Standard. I co-founded it alongside Martin and two others who I'm not sure if they want to be named because of life's gone on 10 years hence. But put things in context when we founded. So it's April now, and people remember the statue of Rhodes was let's say, surge was thrown at it. I can't think of a better euphemism. Around March, if I remember correctly. Now, I remember this was my first year of university, and I remember there was a sense of almost like that South African rainbow nation sort of multicultural unity at campus running up to that point. I remember I was almost looked like the brochures, when you have those multicultural, multiracial friend groups, everyone getting along, sitting on the grass, and that was real. But when the surge was thrown at the statue, and I was actually there. Fortunately, not when it was thrown. I was heading home, and I didn't. I walked past when it looked like a protest about to happen. But I remember the guy, and Chimani Maxwell. I'm trying. It's been so long, yeah. And I remember him with his hard cap, being almost naked, carrying his bucket. Fortunately, I think the bucket was closed because I don't remember the smell. And he was waiting, and he was waiting for something. I walked past. He was on the way back down, and there were a bunch of photographers who were like arriving. He was like waiting for them. And goes into a little bit more of how fabricated that event really was. It wasn't just some spontaneous thing where a guy got angry, he went and he vandalized it, how much he hates Rhodes and colonialism. The evidence does show that this was a fabricated media event. And unfortunately, for views that the mainstream media wanted, for some clout, just to create a story, it ended up destroying our universities because this event quickly spiraled into vandalism, rioting, and just a complete breakdown of race relations at UCT. I went from having half my friend group be black people. None of them wanted anything to do with any white person anymore. They created this entire block where you were not allowed to be friends with a white person, with a colored person, with an Indian person. They imposed their own racial segregation. And it just got worse. And it just got to the point where it formed this hateful nationalism that then escalated, that merged, as it always does, with socialism. You could call it national socialism. And and that escalated into fees must fall near the end of the year, where universities across the entire country started demanding free education, despite all evidence, despite the fact that deserving students who can't afford university are already covered by NSFAS or scholarships. The fact that we need to pay for expenses at university and paying students actually end up subsidizing deserving poor students, all that was ignored. And it resulted in billions of rands worth of damage, where infrastructure was destroyed, windows shattered, surge thrown. I know many of the exams which I sat in, bricks were thrown through the window of the sports centre at UCT, raw surge was thrown through the door. Sometimes they would call off the exam, but eventually it just got to the point where we just kept on writing. And then when that happened, sometimes protests would come in and they would tear people's exams. And this happened in UCT, at the university currently known as Rhodes, or was it formerly known as Rhodes? I lost track. I don't think anyone, I haven't heard of Rhodes for ages now. I think that the protests made that university irrelevant. It
It
happened,
may actually just be a former university,
yes,
regardless of
exactly.
the name.
The university that was formerly a university. Um, And it even happened at Stellenbosch, which has managed to escape most of the recent resurgences. But I think, in case you don't know, Stellenbosch is almost like riot proof. It's far away from a lot of the universities where people care about these things. It tends to be quite a conservative student body compared to other universities. It's a university, so it's still going to be quite left wing. But the fact that there was assault on the Stellenbosch campus just showed how big this thing was. South Africans have very short memories. People have already forgotten about the 2021 KZN riots. So I think a lot of people 10 years later have forgotten about Fees Must Fall, except for UCT, it seems, because this year they had their 10-year anniversary where they didn't commemorate the destruction of priceless works of art, of the burning of books, the suicide of staff that were bullied by Fallist leaders. They celebrated Fallism. They celebrated the Rhodes Must Fall. They celebrated as the person who effectively built the university was completely written out of its history, where it wasn't interrogated as the complexity of history and the complexity of where we come from. It was just torn down and forgotten. They celebrated the people who called for science to fall, where mathematics must be decolonized, where effectively, where professors got away with having exam questions where the answer was that no, white and black people can never get along. This was not challenged by the university. It was something that they want to remind us of. Where, honestly, when I saw the protest happening earlier this year, I was just thinking, has it been a few months? Has it been a few years? No, it's been 10 years and nothing really has changed except that the university's just gotten worse.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's kind of the context in which the four of us, I think we were all students back then, established a rational standard because, I mean, yeah, you alluded to it, like it's a university, so you almost expect it to be kind of somewhere to the left of Karl Marx, but what was less kind of expected was the almost unanimous press engagement with this thing, and this it was basically this is a legitimate grievances by some students. They are protesting against exclusion and so on. So cool stuff, cool beans. And no one said, hey, it's like maybe the premise of their protest is a little bit questionable. We had NSFAS back then. We had all these programs for excluded students. The universities were already bending over backwards back then to seem to be on the right side of social justice. But still, you had the press kind of just breathing more kind of oxygen onto the fire that was Fallism, and to a very large degree, and I don't think I'm necessarily overstating it. I think Fallism was the kind of the true arrival of systematic and formalized what you today call for wokeism, kind of in South Africa. You obviously had a lot of that before, but really Fallism was when it reached, I think, critical mass, and after that point, I think it's just become so, I mean, virtually impossible to be someone who is somewhat center right, or even, I mean, banish the thought of having someone right wing or far right at a South African university campus, just in the interest of balanced views. Morné, what's your take on all of this?
Yeah, I think that I also remember those days, and I think that one thing that, as you were talking now, just stood out to me is the fact that this was almost our sort of 2020, the BLM riots in the US, except it's the one thing in which South Africa tends to innovate ahead of other countries, and it's the one thing which we're quite happy to export to everybody are these bad ideas. And for some reason, I'm not sure whether that's something you can put a tariff on necessarily, but it is something
So
that
one kind of tariff we support, I think.
yeah, well, I wish we could just get rid of it internally as well. But it's the one thing which we tend to be ahead of other countries with. And another thing that that I recall happening in those days, I was also, although I think I was a little bit later in my university career than you guys were, but I remember the extent to which I was at UP then, at Tuckies, and I just remember the extent to which the actual staff at the university were involved in sort of facilitating and fomenting and, sometimes organizing all of the various events and the destruction and all those sorts of things. And just the fact that, you said the press were treating it with kid gloves or something like that. But yeah, it was just, there was this weird thing where, and we've never really recovered from it. Although I think there might be signs now. Ugh, no, okay. Let me take that back immediately. There might be hopeful signs outside of the mainstream press, but yeah, there's the fact that it was sort of treated as, prima facie legitimate. These guys must have a point. Let's take them seriously. Let's not reject it. And I mean, in the case of Rhodes itself, I just remember that the previous time that people wanted to remove Rhodes's statue, it was a bunch of Afrikaners who said they were anti-colonialists. And and it was just always ironic to me that it eventually did happen, but in a completely different context and with a completely different bent in the media itself. But it's just always funny, the typical sort of horseshoe theory, and that you always get with these things. But yeah, it was clear even then that the press and the whatever the upper echelons of universities, the quote unquote elite, I suppose, in society, the intelligentsia, they were never really acting with the amount of seriousness that you'd expect them to. There was just this sort of gut reaction that this is definitely a very legitimate cause, and we might not agree with all the means by which they're going to achieve it. But I mean, they were treated as heroes at that time, and I'm not sure whether something like that to happen today, that we've learned anything. I think it would be pretty much the same treatment that we got back then.
Yeah, and I think if you look at the press statement that was released announcing the commemoration of the 10th anniversary by the university, I think the language is quite instructive, because in some ways it kind of, like you said, valorizes some of this destructive behavior. But then it's also couched in kind of corporatist speak around consensus seeking and inclusivity. So it says the commemorative event will be held on Wednesday, the 9th of April, the day the Cecil John Rhodes statue was removed from UCT's campus after a month of protest, consensus gathering, and support by Senate and Council. And then it says it was an intense era characterized by robust contestations within the university and broader stakeholders. robust consultation.
That's one word, yes.
Robust contestation, sorry. The organizers envisaged this occasion as a moment of critical reflection on a movement that profoundly challenged the higher education sector with impact far wide and beyond academia. I think that much is true. but yeah, I think one of the most concerning aspects of that was that, yeah, however you view the grievances and the legitimacy of those grievances around student funding, that people were quite willing to overlook wanton acts of violence and vandalism. I think the fact that art was torn from the walls and burnt in effigy outside of Smuts Hall, which is no longer called Smuts Hall. It's now called Upper Campus Residence. And, if you visit the campus, you'll still see the kind of the palimpsest of the old name written on the wall. And, I think basically this idea of trying to erase history, I think, is very problematic. Like Nicholas was saying, someone like Rhodes himself was a complicated figure. Yeah, he certainly would not be considered a kind of liberal-minded person, but the whole Grooteskuur estate was his endowment, part of his estate. So the university would not exist if it were not for Cecil John Rhodes. Yeah, and so, I think as somebody who went to UCT myself in the early 2000s, I was reflecting on this the other day, that it was actually kind of a golden era in the university. It was there was definitely a lot of left-wing politics. But if I think of the political theory courses that I took, for example, we would learn about the canon of Western political thought, going back to Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, John Stuart Mill. And in those courses, we would certainly discuss Karl Marx and John Rawls and so on. But there was an attempt, at least, to provide a kind of a broad spectrum of ideas. And yeah, I think what was interesting is at the time there was also quite a lot of postmodern thinking, the likes of Foucault and Derrida and Deleuze. But this kind of predominated in the English literature departments, maybe the media studies departments. And it was sort of seen as kind of quaint and interesting. It always felt very opaque to me, and I thought that it was because of my intellectual limitations. But actually, I at some point realized that it's deliberately obtuse. You're not supposed to really understand it. It kind of hides behind this inscrutable language. And so, yeah, I think kind of an instructive lesson that actually you should take ideas seriously, and ideas can be dangerous. The wrong ideas can be dangerous, and that they can destroy institutions. And you shouldn't take the strength or the integrity of an institution for granted, that they can be overcome by bad ideas. And if you don't stand up against those bad ideas, it can actually very easily and quickly erode the very foundations of the institution itself.
Yeah, and the I guess the thing that we were interested in as students, because I mean we were kind of at the coal face of it. I still remember I was never kind of at University of Pretoria as well. I never kind of engaged with the violence, but I do remember my classes being disrupted by Fallist protesters, and kind of you see this happening, and you kind of I was studying law, obviously, and already the academics and so on were, geez, I would want to use the word indoctrinating us into quite clearly leftist thought. I mean, here in private law, you had kind of, yeah, it's technical, legal categorization, but the second you stepped out of that into anything resembling a normative course, like jurisprudence, like legal philosophy, legal history, even, you would get fed kind of this stuff, and this is the kind of stuff that intellectually underlied the Fallist movement. And our concern, kind of founding the Rational Standard, was that you have this broad public out there, and all that they know about what's happening now is what the press tells them. The press was the interface between what was happening on campus and the general public. And kind of our thinking was, my goodness, someone has to say what's actually happening here. And thankfully it wasn't just us students kind of wet behind the ears, people inexperienced in life, but eventually we had older kind of retired academics, Professor Timothy Crow, very kind of involved at UCT, submitting very high quality articles to the Rational Standard, some other people kind of involved in the discourse, really ultimately deconstructing this whole thing. And I mean, Rational Standard wasn't just about Fallism, but very much an engagement with the things that people assume are just normal, which actually have an underlying toxicity to it, I guess. And I think we did a good job at saying that actually this is at least some of the, so we were clearly ideological liberals and so on, but at least some of this is what the mainstream press ought to be saying. And Morné was alluding to this earlier, and I think this is the sad thing. If it were to happen again today, I not only do I think that it would be the same experience, I think it would be so much worse than what it was in 2015. In 2015, I mean, the concept of a lie existed, and then the concept of falsehood existed. But today there is this armory of what is called misinformation and disinformation, and I can just, my goodness, if I had to apply the fees must fall protest today, I can already see that if someone said, oh, they burned a car, then there would be a fact check on that, and they'll be like, yeah, it's partly true, but there's missing context. You see, yes, they did burn a car, but they did it for kind of social justice, and
The car
therefore
was in
kind of
in their way of this peaceful
exactly
protest.
No, I
the
think
car
they
was part of the
deepfaked the
structure of
flames.
oppression.
They deepfaked the flames in real life. The AI
Yes, yeah,
created
yeah.
the heat.
It's a fabrication. This photo and this video is generated. I mean, that is the type of stuff that I would expect you would see today, because the journalists, and I mean, of course, there's good journalists out there. Like, if you're a good journalist and you're watching this, I'm not talking to you, so no, please do not be offended. Um, the the kind of the preference for vibes, for lack of a better word. I use this word a lot now because it's so versatile. But journalists have this overwhelming preference nowadays for vibes. If the vibes seem to be somewhat fluffy and good, then whatever is happening must necessarily be a good thing. I mean, we cannot report. I mean, the UCT press release. I like that they talk about there should we're now doing critical reflection on on what happened, and most people reading this, oh, critical thinking, kind of critical means critical thinking, when in fact it's critical as in critical theory. It's a very kind of different approach to analysis, what they have in mind when they say critical there. And certainly this is what the press now also apply. I mean, this year has been a roller coaster. We've talked about it on this podcast for weeks now, of almost from the second Ramaphosa signed the Expropriation Act into law, and Trump tweeted against that. The press has done this thing of saying it's all misinformation without saying what is actually wrong, and in fact validating what is being said. They said, no, it's actually correct. We just disagree with the vibes. And I mean, to me, that is clearly the impetus for having a robust. I mean, we used to call it alternative press, like Rational Standard is, maybe like Daily Friend is, Politics Web, but increasingly, I'm starting to think that what we used to call the alternative press needs to simply become the new press, that that either replaces the old press or creates the pressure for the old press to I mean, shed whatever that
Yeah.
condition is that it's currently trafficking under. Um,
Yeah, I do think there are some differences today, and I think one of the major differences, and why I think that now is actually the perfect time to launch it, is because whilst the press has sort of just continued on this proven not to work strategy, the public has moved on since then. I think that 10 years ago there was a lot of general public support, or at least sort of sense that you're supposed to be tolerant of that kind of I suppose you'd call it stinky but mostly peaceful protests. In the case of the, the sewage and things, but the public's no longer there. They've moved on. The press haven't. The press have pretty much stayed where they were, or in some cases, I think, just gone absolutely mad. But the public hasn't. I think that the reason why there's now a need for a ramped up rational standard is because there's an increased need for sort of a refuge from all this pandering to the government, pandering to these left-wing causes. People need a refuge, and more than that, they just need a place where they can get a rational analysis of things. That's something that's at least reliable, something that at least to some extent speaks to their thoughts, speaks to what they're feeling, and doesn't berate them for not falling in line with the exact opinion of, unfortunately, very, very harmful ideologies.
Yeah, I mean, and I think what's also interesting to observe is how technology has changed the way we distribute ideas. We're doing this live stream with fairly minimal effort and cost, which is fantastic. We can speak directly to our audience. But we're also going to be utilizing Substack as a distribution platform for Rational Standard. So back in the day when Nicholas and Martin and others started RS, it was just a normal website, nothing wrong with that. But now we're going to be taking advantage of a really exciting growth platform, I think. If you look at what Barry Weiss of the Free Press has done, she's essentially created her own media publication, little mini empire. She used to be a writer at the New York Times and was sort of like the token normie or token centrist, but then she kind of got axed a few years ago, and then she started the Free Press. And now, I mean, this is seen as a really credible, authoritative news source. And some of the traditional news sources in the United States and elsewhere are suffering declining numbers. And I think it's because people want to gain access to truthful commentary, rational perspectives that they might not necessarily be getting from some of the mainstream platforms that are bending to pressures of political correctness or trying to play to the gallery and so on. So I think audiences, their consumer habits have also changed quite a bit. And yeah, the beauty of Substack as well is that there's a direct to email function. So, if you're not familiar with the app, you can receive all of the articles and content delivered straight to your inbox, which I think is really great. So yeah, we're really excited by the platform. I mean, we've noticed people like Professor Johan Fourie in Stellenbosch. He's an economic historian. Some of his content is really excellent, and he has built quite a significant audience there. So I think this is really the future of deep alternative commentary and where you can play to niche audiences and then grow from there.
Yeah, Nicholas, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, I was actually also wanted to comment about as now the Rational Standard is not just an alternative to Fallism and the radical left as well. I love that we a lot of alternative media, and I think I agree with you completely. We need to start adjusting that term because all media is effectively digital these days. In the past, the only thing that really separated alternative media and mainstream press was a production quality. Big news houses could mass print newspapers. Nobody cares about newspapers these days. So that's so even if you have the newspapers out there, you still need a digital presence. News 24 is the largest news house in South Africa. Last time I checked, I'm pretty sure they still are. And you never really see their newspapers out there. They've got the City Press thing in print, but you don't see a News 24 paper in every single stall. In fact, do they have one? I stand to be corrected. I don't think they have a print edition.
Daily Maverick have introduced a print version, yeah.
So I remember seeing Daily Maverick ones a while back. But yeah, actually, and Daily Maverick, some people called that alternative media in the past. I remember years ago when I was a student, people said, "Oh, Daily Maverick, that's alternative media." So there isn't much distinction anymore, as you said. It's all information. There's a war between information. We no longer can just trust that a highly funded news house is going to give us the truth. Anyone with an internet connection can actually go out there and enter the culture war, enter the information war. And the problem is it is a war. And currently the main sides fighting are a vehement and deceitful critical social justice left, which has been traditionally our main enemy. But also on the other side, I love the term woke right, which echo the exact same tactics and sentiments as the left, but just with different priorities. But at the end of the day, they both just want to control people's lives. They want to force their worldview on other people, and they're also based in. I use the term. I'm going to use the term because I use this a lot, but misinformation. Um, and I think the rational standard fits. I hate this term, but a very good center in between them. As well, we're not centrists. We do have an ideology. We believe that there is a worldview. Our worldview allows other people to have their own worldviews.
Exactly. I think that's an important point. I mean, we and I not just rational standard, but I guess our kind of ecosystem
Mm.
has, I guess, in the last 20 or so years, 40 years, been somewhat associated with the right, and I've not really objected to that too much. I think that that's potentially a fair enough kind of characterization, although kind of what right means. I mean, left has always been quite clear, but what right means seems to always kind of be a little bit iffy. I do think it's fair to say we're not left, even though Bastiat sat on the left, and we're all kind of intellectual descendants of Frederick Bastiat, and he was a French assemblyman. But we've tended to be associated with the right, and I think that the right has, and you've alluded to this, I think the right is now potentially in danger. And it's not me as kind of a liberal saying this, and I know liberalism is hated by the right, but people like James Lindsay, some very conservative people, particularly Americans, but some very conservative people have in recent years started saying, "Ugh, something is going on the right that we need to just at least be careful of." And I think that's a good rule of thumb. We must, I mean, we criticize the left for this. We all know that there are sensible people on the left. They exist, but they have failed kind of epically to keep their house clean. And I think to the degree that you could say that we kind of exist somewhere on the right of the political spectrum, we do have that obligation to at least make an effort to say, listen, tariffs are bad. Like, let's just not kind of beat around the bush. Tariffs are bad. An international body is not necessarily a bad thing. Uh, some expert somewhere giving advice is not necessarily a globalist trying to destroy your whole way of life. Someone immigrating from Syria is not necessarily something to kind of invoke the power of the state against. And yeah, I mean, the other thing as well, the right has traditionally said that personal responsibility is key, and that's, to me, that is the big attractive point of conservatism. I'm a liberal, but what I love about conservatism is the emphasis it places on you to kind of take care of not just yourself but your family, your community, your area, and so on. um, and yet the new kind of woke right is already kind of shedding that to some degree and saying, no, no, but actually the government is our daddy, and the government must kind of take responsibility for all these things, and that's a problem. That's something to press back against. And I think Rational Standard has always been well positioned on this. There are people who lean more left to write for us, or who used to write for us, and I'm sure many of them will return. Certainly, some of the confirmed authors I know that are going to write for us certainly lean quite a bit more to the left, and there are certainly others that lean quite a bit more to the right. But at least this crowd is united by a shared kind of foundation of liberty, that the freedom of the individual, but also the individual in community with others, is the guiding light in discourse. And yeah, I mean, there was a time, I think, when the mainstream press to some degree bought into this, at least in the West, and that isn't the case, assuredly not today. And the Rational Standard, in kind of cooperation with the other outlets that have kind of in the interim since 2015 come about, I think are going to, and I mean, we're hearing some interesting things about other outlets being established as we speak, kind of in this space. Very exciting. We obviously welcome the competition and the cooperation, as of course that's bound to occur, to actually start, as Morné says, giving the public but also writers this refuge. And and the important thing there is that yes, the public has moved on, and I think there does exist now a real possibility which didn't exist in 2015 of these alternative platforms growing to displace the mainstream platforms. I mean, the mainstream can reform itself and do better, and all power to them to do that. But if they don't, the collapse, I think, is necessarily going to continue. David spoke about Barry Weiss. I mean, it's unthinkable that the free press is doing as well as it is doing. I mean, it was almost an overnight sensation, and it's not surprising why. Just with how uh, uh, consensus is a positive word, but the consensus amongst the mainstream press about bad ideas, it's not surprising at all that these alternatives are thriving, especially in the podcast space, but also increasingly in the written word space.
Yeah, I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, it's John O'Sullivan. He was either a speechwriter or just an advisor for Margaret Thatcher, who said at one point that any institution that isn't explicitly conservative or something like that, or has some sort of explicit value statement, will tend towards progressivism eventually. And I actually thought of that when Nicholas was speaking about the Daily Maverick, and I think that's almost exactly what happened there. Is it was actually it would qualify as alternative media at that stage, because it really did have that sort of almost transgressive kind of feeling. You did see a variety of perspectives at that point, but they never really had a sort of anchoring, guiding sort of principle. And I think that you see that in the political environment as well. I think it's called it's affective polarization, where people actually agree on ideology, or they agree on what's supposed to happen, but they vehemently disagree on who's supposed to do it. So you sort of have these, and that's why the left-right thing's becoming increasingly difficult to actually piece out, because I mean, at the moment, I see very little difference between the Trumpian economic model and the Bernie Sanders version of it, at least insofar as trade is concerned. They seem pretty similar to me, and yet the one would be seen as far right, and the other one, I suppose, if you're looking at the press, would be seen as center left. Because I've never met a far left person in my life. There's far right, and then there's center left. I've never met a far left person. But yeah, so it is important to have an institution that does have a a kernel around which it builds, a principle around which it builds all of the things that it does, because otherwise you'll get this this almost natural sort of trend towards ideological progressivism. But it's also important to have that principle be something worthwhile. And I think that in our case, or in the Rational Standards case, there's something quite valuable there. The notion that we're open to engaging with ideas, we're open to different perspectives, and it's really only subject to allowing other people to air their perspectives as well, and being open to criticism. Not being being open to having your mind change, and also making sure that you don't change it unnecessarily, I suppose, is the guiding light there.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, if you think of Daily Maverick, I mean, actually, in the early days, their byline was for people with money and brains. And I remember people like Stephen Curtis very explicitly saying, this is a proudly capitalist magazine. So I don't know what happened to the editorial direction. But I suppose one of the risks with online publications or platforms is that you can expose yourself to audience capture, that there is this very effective feedback loop that you get when you have a particular take or you adopt a position, where you can see in real time what your audience thinks about that through views and clicks and distribution. But then that means that there is this risk that you can gravitate towards more and more extreme positions, or and that your audience shapes you rather than you influencing your audience.
I wanted to add on to the discussion on bias and having a worldview for a platform, because actually, because it links to what you're saying, David, about that almost feedback loop of audiences informing views, and also what you're saying, Morné, about making sure that how non-ideological platforms tend to stray left. And one of our intentions when we founded the Rational Standard was that we saw with how all these apparently non-biased news sources like News 24 and all those, they claim to be neutral. They claim that, that we're reporting the news, we're unbiased. But we could see, no, everyone has a bent, everyone has an ideology. And ironically, the Rational Standard, we were founded and we said, hey, we have a bias. We're only going to publish people with these particular broad taints of liberal, libertarian, maybe conservative views. Yeah, we do publish conservative views, not conservative, depends. But we ended up actually publishing far more than that as well. We've published people who disagree with us. We've published other viewpoints. And I think the big thing about Rational Standard is that we fill in a very good space between being an op-ed site, but also kind of a little bit of a journal. So that we're not as formal and as unapproachable as an academic journal, but we're not as silly and as vapid as just TikTok and reels, where most people sadly get their news now. Like we were talking about all these different alternative media. Everyone's getting their news from TikTok now. So we're existing in a space between that.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, you can draw an analogy between what you consume in terms of news and what you consume in terms of food. Like if you had to go back 100 years ago, the availability of calories was a lot less prolific. So if you had to look at indices of human development, like people have never had as much access to food as they have now, and it's the same with information, right? Like you have everybody walks around with a device in their pocket that can access the entirety of all human knowledge that's ever been produced. And yet we spend our days scrolling through 30-second TikToks and YouTube shorts, which give us that instant dopamine hit, instead of reading Plato and Aristotle and all the greats of the Western canon. So yeah, there are kind of certain incentives to the internet. So in a way, if you look at a country like the United States, there's an epidemic of obesity there, people over consuming the wrong kinds of foods. But then for those who are interested in healthy consumption, it's never been a better time to calibrate your diet and to know exactly what you're putting into your body. And people are really delving deeply into their health because they take it seriously. So you have this paradox of abundance that on the one hand you have overconsumption, on the other hand you have this ability to really craft a diet that is optimal. And it's the same with your news consumption. Like if you really take the development of ideas seriously, like the internet is an amazing place. It's an abundant place. But it can also be, you can also spend hours of your life just absorbing rubbish, right? Which is not good for your brain or your worldview. So yeah, I like to think that the Rational Standard is on the optimization, that kind of side of things, that we're a place where you can really go for intellectual stimulation and to really challenge your thinking.
Yeah, I think the kind of advantage that it would have is that there would be insight, but also relatability. When you kind of engage with what the mainstream press tends to put out, you just get the sense that there is it's always rich when people say this, and I've criticized them before, but I'm going to do it now. But a disconnect between what they're saying and what reality is, what is actually happening. I mean, accusing some kind of foodie star of only giving boerewors rolle to black people, only to white people and excluding black people. Just saying that because it's sensational, but obviously it was disproven by Jan Bray within like an hour or something like that. The proof was in. So there's just this lack of relatability, and you get that from almost everything. I mean, I've complained about how the press have been engaging with the race law thing for a while now, and it's every South African who is peripherally engaged with kind of policy knows that South Africa has race laws. Like until 10 minutes ago, everyone understood this, but now you have the press saying, no, 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 this is disinformation. It's completely wrong. It's lies, and I think your kind of average reader actually, where they might not read it and think, wow, I hate the mainstream press, they're lying, but they do, I think, detect that there is something going on here, and I think increasingly you're gonna get people like that. If you look at some of the alternative platforms we've mentioned, Free Press, but in South Africa, Morning Shot is an alternative kind of podcast news show by where Roman Kabanak used to be associated. It has kind of blown up in views. Within hours, it has tens of thousands of views, and it's 15, 20 minutes, 20-minute shows. It's not terribly short form. Joe Rogan, I mean, it's 3 hour long segments with millions of people watching. So there is, yes, people get their news from TikTok, but there is also an appetite for insightful and relatable content. And I think we're stepping kind of into that arena, and then just kind of something that I've often said that people find very contentious, but I've always found the previous press model in South Africa to be the ideal, and that is that effectively the political parties establish their own media houses, and then effectively you have Naspers, National Press, still existing today, but now it's Prog Press, effectively. Uh, they are the mouthpiece of national conservatism in South Africa. The English press was very kind of clearly the mouthpiece of more liberal-minded uh, um, South Africans in those days. And it was not like, oh, geez, the Naspers papers are lying to us or the progressive press is lying to us. It was, I know what their bias is, and now I can evaluate what they're telling me on that basis. I have more information at my disposal, and everyone just engages kind of with the discourse, with the news cycle in a far more productive fashion than this pretense to neutrality. That's why I think the American press, to some degree, they have that, where Fox News is obviously a tends to be pro-Trump kind of conservative platform. You're not going to find woke people on Fox News. Everyone understands this. Everyone knows this. That doesn't mean everything Fox News says is wrong. It just means that it comes from a specific perspective. Same with MSNBC on the other side, and Huffington Post, and so on. But there is just that greater understanding, which up to now I think South Africa has lacked, where most people that I encounter who are outside of our ecosystem would still be outraged. They'll be like, "Oh, look at how the press is lying," and so on, and they just don't get that you are being fed something ideological ultimately, and that's why you have to make this clear. You have to declare your biases up front, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing to be ashamed about being a journalist, being a reporter, and saying, I write for the Jacobin and I am a reporter, and obviously that informs my perspectives. The Germans do it, the British do it. We used to do it in South Africa. The Americans do it to some degree. So it could potentially be us stepping into a more healthy understanding of what the press is and what the press is saying. But it's not gonna this impulse is not gonna come from the mainstream press. They are very comfortable where they are, and that is why I think with platforms like the Rational Standard and many others, we are going to put pressure on them, and I think to some degree you are seeing that, and hopefully it's going to become just kind of pick up speed, so that we all know where we stand with each other.
Yeah, in many ways, this idea of a newspaper of record is a bit of a myth. I mean, I suppose you could have said 20 years ago that like the New York Times would have been something of a paper of record. the first blueprint of history, that kind of hackneyed idea. But I think we're well past that. If there was ever a case where that existed, I think, and yeah, I mean, I think the beauty of some of this diversification of media outlets is you're not pretending to be everything to everyone. Like the Rational Standard doesn't have a sports section or a crossword puzzle or horoscopes. It's about very particular kind of analysis. So yeah, if people want to go and read about sport, they can go and do so somewhere else, right? And so you can segment your audience in that respect. Yeah, so I mean, if you think of like a media figure like Walter Cronkite during he was a broadcaster, and during the Vietnam War in 1968, the Tet Offensive, he went to Vietnam and he came back and reported that he doesn't think that the United States can win the war in Vietnam and that they should seek a kind of an honorable exit. And that really shifted public opinion at that time. There were, I think, 3 news broadcasters in the United States, and Walter Cronkite was really like the voice of the nation in that respect. But now you've got everybody arguing from their different perspectives, and I think, yeah, that does create difficulty in establishing what is the truth of the matter sometimes. But my question would be, would you want to go back to that Walter Cronkite kind of era? Because, the problem with these kind of spokespeople of the nation is that they can also be gatekeepers. They can be captured, they can be swayed in a particular way, and they can hide behind their neutrality. So, yeah, I think that my answer to the question of would you go back to the old media model, I think it would be a no. But I do think that there are some kind of problems and challenges with the current landscape.
I think there's. Sorry, do you want to go back? Or should
No. I was going to prompt you.
Oh, yes. I was going to say, I think there's always been problems with history has never been nice. I think lately, with everything going on, with tariff madness, the end of the Pax Americana and everything, I've been feeling a little bit down. But honestly, history has never been a peaceful time where we have an ideal media, we have an ideal government. There's no wars or anything. I think there were definitely pluses to the old way the media worked. I think there was also definitely things wrong with it. I think talking about capital, it used to be in the publishing industry and in media that you had to have a lot of money to run a media house. Warren Buffett, one of his big purchases was Washington Post. Correct me if I'm wrong. And he said it because. No, I mean. Washington. What was the one that Warren Buffett bought it decades ago?
Okay, well, maybe it was him.
Yeah, but he used to buy. He actually bought a bunch. He bought local papers, and the reason he did it is because that's how the only way that people could get information, and people want information. But now that model has changed because information's been democratized. It's been spread out, and that's good. I think it is ultimately good because it opens. It means that. Well, we like decentralization. We're decentralists. We don't want information to be controlled by one singular elite. But at the same time, it also makes the job of spreading the truth harder, and there are a lot more people who can spread misinformation. But also at the same time, it's always been this way. The Nazis had their own media houses where they were printing out misinformation, sharing anti-Semitic propaganda. The Soviets and the Bolsheviks, they had their crap that they were pushing around to change public opinion. I think the only difference is that phones are a lot easier to spread information than brochure printing. But I think it's just life goes on, and I think that we currently have challenges today, and I think that all that's about is seizing what the current state is and pushing towards what you believe will make things slightly better.
Yeah, I think that I think to a large extent you just couldn't go back to that model right now, and I think one of the big changes, or at least one of the big perceived changes, something that appears to have changed according, as far as I can tell, is that it's more than just a detachment between the media and the readers or the populace. it's almost a kind of contempt. And I think it was really, I think where I really saw this kind of bleed out was during the pandemic, during COVID, when the media almost took a explicitly antagonistic relationship. They took an antagonistic stance against the citizenry. They sort of stood behind government and said, or stood in front of government even, and said, "Don't worry, we're going to fight against the people for you." It's not speaking truth to power; it's speaking power to truth. If they want to come to us with truth, we'll just say, "Well, guess who has the power? Guess who's the ones that get to determine what's right and what's wrong? It's us, and it's the government, and we're not going to allow you to take part in these discussions." And I think that's a lot of these sort of debunking and a lot of the commentary and analysis in the mainstream press. It's not just that they don't understand the ordinary South African's opinion. It's that they hate it. It's that they don't want it to exist. They're not saying you're wrong. They're saying you're evil. So I think that's why you never could go back, because I mean, there's a reason why people don't trust the media, and it's because the media hate them. It's because the media think that they are a bunch of buffoons who, if left to their own devices, will not trust everything that the government says to the same extent that everyone in the media feels that it's incumbent upon them. So it's this weird thing where they're sort of dependent upon the public, but they also don't really trust the public. They don't trust the public to actually come to the right conclusion. And that's it's all gone along with this idea that journalism is no longer about giving facts. It's about advocating for a particular position. And that's what we've seen. We've seen it, like Martin said, from the point at which Cyril signed that EWC law act now. And since Trump had that Truth Social about very bad things happening in South Africa, the media immediately said, let's see, what are all the arguments against the government? Let's attack each one of them. And these fact checks are, it really is ridiculous, the level at which it's taking place. And the degree to which they contradict each other, the degree to which they say, no, null compensation doesn't mean without compensation. It's something completely different. And then you get all the politicians saying, we're going to expropriate property and we're going to do it without compensation. I'm just waiting for the fact check on that to say, no, President Ramaphosa is incorrect when he says that he's going to expropriate property without compensation.
No, they're going to say what he actually meant
was. No, it's false. He has been spreading misinformation. And it's going to lead to divestment in South Africa, because the president is under the mistaken impression that null compensation means without compensation. I mean, that's what they would have done if there was a rally from, I don't know who, AfriForum or Solidarity or someone, and if they said at a rally they want to take property without compensation, it would have been fact-checked. Or even if they said, no, this is what they actually want to do, or this is, they're just dressing it up in other words or in nicer sounding words, then that would have been fact checked and put out as this is clearly false. So, I mean, an objective media, a media that you could reference in the past, would have said, I mean, what is the actual fact of the matter? It's our job to tell the public, what are the facts, and they have to decide what they make with those facts. But to say, we're here to actually defend the policy, that's not the role of the press, despite the fact that they seem to think that that's their role. And I think that that's that, and together with combined with the fact that it's quite clear that there's this sort of knee-jerk pro-ANC, pro-GNU reaction amongst the press, regardless of the topic almost. And that means that there's an anti whoever opposes them stance as well. And I mean, it's sometimes quite explicit. It's not always they're not always hiding it very well. and you can see that particularly with leadership in these very big media institutions. But yeah, so I think you can talk about going back, and you can talk about the degree to which it was actually better in those days. But I just don't think it's possible. At least not with the media environment we have now, or the institutions we have now, because
Yeah.
I don't think they're interested in it.
I remember one editor of a national newspaper during COVID taking videos from his apartment balcony of people walking their dogs and kind of publicly shaming them on Twitter, which I think was a bit of a low point. But yeah, I think as a general rule of thumb, you shouldn't hate your audience. And I'd like to take this moment to announce that the Rational Standard editorial board does not hate its readers. In fact, loves them very much.
We love
Yes,
all of our
come
readers.
back to
We
engage with our
love them,
content.
even though we might disagree with them very often.
Yeah.
I mean, so yeah, I'm gonna echo what David said in that. So I said earlier that I like the previous model, and I didn't mean the model that was just discussed, but more the sense that when there were biases, the media revealed the biases. I think that is something that should come back. But I think as far as the decentralized media is concerned, I think it's just in all respects better. I know you all kind of alluded to the fact that it's more difficult now to establish what the truth is, but I think that we have a remarkable ability to kind of read between the lines, especially if we have read both perspectives. We tend to see what it is that they're agreeing on, and that tends to be what the facts are. And I mean, the normative perspective on, especially on policy and politics, is kind of facts kind of become the borders of facts become a little bit blurry. When it comes to EWC, for instance, will there be confiscations? I mean, there's no fact really here. It's a question of what is the ANC going to do. We're going to say that we have analyzed the ANC over a period of 30 years. We think that it's very clear that they intend to use this as a confiscation tool. And the press is going to say, well, we spoke to the president on the phone yesterday and he said they're not going to confiscate anything. So the kind of question of fact there becomes murky, and that's fine. But the key thing here, and this is where the decentralized point comes in, like I've thought about this a few times this year, and that imagine that we didn't have alternative media. Imagine we didn't have Twitter and TikTok. Imagine if we just had News 24, Daily Maverick, and so on, kind of relatively established press, and we went into 2025 with everything else as it was. There would have, like, geez, if there would have been any note of AfriForum and solidarity going to the US, it would have been kind of couched in almost exclusively treasonous terms. They would have never gotten their own kind of perspective on the matter unless they had their own kind of mailing operation that they send out to their members and so on. But there would have been a complete lack of what I think we would say is the truth and the facts of the matter, because the discourse would have been entirely one-sided, and therefore I think I welcome some of the chaos, and it is chaotic. But if you if you read what the government is saying, and I mean, they have their own, very few people notice, there's something called something like ZA News. It's the government's own literal newspaper, where they put out their own perspectives, and the press media doesn't have to fill that role. The government is doing it just fine. Read what the government is saying, read what the people commenting on that is saying, and you'll get a very good sense of what is happening. But when you are engaging with everyone saying we're objective and neutral, I think then things must necessarily become more difficult for you, because you are, unless you can kind of, you're ideologically trained to understand that this guy is clearly speaking from a kind of a pro-state perspective, and this person is clearly speaking from a communitarian perspective. Unless you have that training, it's going to be very difficult for you. So this must be set up front, and then I think you have a very healthy media landscape. No one kind of thinks that Joe Rogan is this kind of completely aloof kind of guy. He's developed certain biases over the years, and he's very open about kind of what he thinks, and that applies increasingly to people on this alternative in this alternative media space, with the holdouts being, again, the traditional press, and we are thankfully getting close to a point where we break that hold that the traditional press has on the public mind.
So is it called ZA News?
It's something like that, yeah. It's
Or
the
is it called
government's.
Pravda? I'm not sure which.
Yes,
What
yeah,
is it? The
yeah. No, I
newspapers
mean
are.
effectively, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, it's
No,
interesting.
I
I mean,
mean
like
that's
if
effectively
you
what it
speak to
is.
your parents, I mean, when they were reading newspapers, the newspapers would be redacted with information that was not allowed to be published. And I mean, I remember my mother talking to me about Mandela. I mean, she didn't even know that Mandela existed really uh, for years because he just was persona non grata in the press, just wouldn't be mentioned. And I think we kind of forget about those days in which there were kind of blanket prohibitions on speaking about certain things. So yeah, I don't think we should. Yeah, we should be mindful of some of the negative externalities, but I think the current media landscape is far more favorable than in the past.
I think the problems, if we're talking about the lead up to why mainstream media is bad in South Africa, and it's actually very much like how media used to be in the sense of elite central control, is that while we have all these media houses, they're actually very few. So the people who own News 24, own a hang of a Media 24, own a swathes of different papers. Independent, run by Iqbal Survey, who is basically an ANC official. He owns very influential large newspapers. IOL, which is one of the largest news sites in South Africa, is owned by a card-carrying ANC member. So that is so I think that these three main issues of why journalism in South Africa is really bad is ideological capture. So there's a feedback loop that journalists are trained at university, so teaching them to be very biased and to have these ideologies, while also pretending that they're not actually ideological. I don't think that these people say that they're not biased. I think they're not lying. That's the thing. I don't think they know they're biased. I think they think that they're telling the truth. I think that they think that they're the equivalent of medical doctors, and that the fanon that they were taught, which actually has two meanings, the fan canon as well as Franz Fanon, that the Foucault and all those people that they were taught that that's gospel, that they have to teach that nothing else is real. There's also the institutional capture that these editors are hired directly by politicians or businessmen who have their own agendas, where if you don't agree with Iqbal Survey, he's going to fire you. So if you want to keep your job, you're going to have to keep a certain editorial lens. I know for someone who submits to the media a lot, that there's certain editors who just will not publish me because they have their own biases or because they're trying to keep their job. I know some who are very much it's personal, and some of them who are very much that they just know that they will lose their job if they publish something of this opinion. But also there's also just fundamental laziness. Journalism used to be something that, we watch movies where you have a journalist who, is going to uncover some sort of cartel, some secret government conspiracy, and, they do all the legwork, they do all this research, they're sneaking, they're staking out, all this stuff. That doesn't happen anymore. Most journalists these days are going to go on Twitter and they're going to, and they comment, X, and then they're going to screenshot someone's tweet or X, whatever. I still am confused what that platform calls things now. And then they're going to just make a comment about it. They're not going to do anything else. And this is actually making me think of when you talk about the media fact-checking Ramaphosa, about him saying about EWC that no, he's lying. About the Lady R, with the that ship that the U.S. ambassador claimed had munitions headed towards Russia. And the media completely laughed at the idea that, oh no, this ship can't contain ammunition. The government investigated itself and found itself innocent. And can you imagine if we had decent reporters, decent journalists in this country? You would have them watching that ship with binoculars. You would have had some of them trying to sneak aboard. You'd have the fourth estate job is supposed to be to effectively be private sector detectives, but none of them are doing that now. They're all just social media posters who have a longer character limit.
Yeah, but some of those social media posters also are contributing to the unearthing of facts and information as well. So on X, there are community notes, so you can't really get away with peddling fictions and falsehoods for too long until the decentralized nature of it, all of these eyes and ears, you can kind of fact check you, so to speak. Whereas I think what we object to is this kind of like self-appointed guardians of the truth who are actually members of corporate media who have a very specific agenda, who very quick to kind of point out misinformation and so on, but are actually uh, engaging in distortions and falsehoods themselves.
Mm.
Yeah, so I think if you consider some independent writers like Marie-Louise Antoni, for example, I mean, she's just an independent person. She's not affiliated with any institution. Someone like Richard Wilkinson, who's done so much great work on school capture. These are energetic civilians who are going out and investigating things for themselves, and now have created very easily platforms for them to disseminate the truth, and that's been hugely beneficial in terms of public discourse. So yeah, I welcome the chaos as Martin does.
Mm. Yeah, I mean the you mentioned Richard Wilkinson and school capture. I mean the guy is, from what I know, I don't really know him that well. I think he's a lawyer and an accountant or something. But he did what Nicholas was describing. I mean, he called the parents of the children involved. He spoke to the teachers involved. He tried to get in touch with the kind of the schools involved, and he wrote these really deep investigative pieces about what is actually going on here. And I think he does it with a bias I agree with. He's against the kind of ideological toxicity that's kind of seeping into our schools. That is an ideological bias. But he did the legwork. And if you just went to any kind of mainstream press, and they covered these issues a lot. I mean, this was like manna from heaven for our journalists, like racism at these formerly white schools. Like every second post is about these things, but it's these kind of superficial kind of again, like Morné said, kind of just repeating the government line. And the question is, where were the investigative journalists? And I do think we still have good investigative journalists in mainstream press. I remember a while back, someone did a really good deep dive on the car power ship issue, and the kind of potential corruption kind of associated with that. Really good investigative journalism. But you get the sense that to some degree, journalism has been so democratized that the the small number of investigative journalists are just kind of it's a handful of people surrounded by masses upon caters and caters of journalist school graduates being pumped out of our universities who have the sense that they're going to be activists. They're going to be information activists, and they're here to kind of ensure that the public doesn't get the truth, but actually that the public has the right opinion or the left opinion. And yeah, I guess I have some sympathy for those investigative journalists. Although on the other hand, when they themselves also kind of enter the fray on normative discussions, they tend to be mirror images of their less kind of discerning colleagues. And you saw this with the EWC thing. Quite a few investigative journalists who I really respected. Trump's tweet had barely kind of hit the press when they were saying this is mis and disinformation. And yeah, that was very worrying. Because really it's Nicholas mentioned this, and it's something we tend to forget. But the idea of the press, I guess at least in the West, has been that it is this fourth estate. The other estates are kind of the state, the commons, the clergy, kind of all checks and balances on power. And here come the press, the fourth estate, also a check and balance on power. But if you look at how they've treated specifically AfriForum, and I know people have kind of their own views on AfriForum, but at least people must agree that AfriForum is not a enabler of state power. I mean, let's at least agree about that. It is something that certainly tries to check state power. And yet, AfriForum, they were the mamparas of the week, whereas kind of Cyril Ramaphosa was the kind of who was it, Adrian? Like one of the News 24 people called him like majestic or something at some point.
It wouldn't be the first time that they call him. They just grab out a thesaurus and what's the highest compliment you could pay someone, and then they just list at least two or three of those in an article. But
Yes.
yeah, I think just before, sorry, just to interrupt you, I do think that that's an important point. Is the whole point of having a press is to keep government accountable. If you are going to have a bias, it should be a bias that says we are going to be pro the people and anti the government or anti-government abuse at the very least. And I mean, that's if you're not going to do that, then at least say you're not going to pick sides in the fight. You just want to be as neutral as possible. But they've done neither of those two. They've decided they're going to take part in this fight, but they just picked the side of the government, and they've picked the side of the state. And sorry, I've got to give you one second. It was just something else that came up in my mind just now. It's just that that's also where we differ from, say, the American media. Is I do think that in the American media, although it is changing now, it's almost, people think it's a very ideologically polarized media. There's left wing media and there's right wing media. I don't actually think that describes the media landscape in the US that well. I think it is more of a that previous model that you discussed in South Africa. It's almost more of a party media. So I mean,
Partisan. Yeah.
yeah, it's partisan media. It's Fox News is pro the Republican Party or pro Trump in this case because he's the leader, and they're going to support what he says. Whatever he does. They don't have sort of a core um, you know value that they're saying we're pro free markets. So if he's anti free markets, that means we're against him. It's no, we're pro this party, and we're going to fall in line with what they say. And the same thing on the left. MSNBC would support whatever the Democrat agenda is. Uh, it's not as though they're sort of staunchly
Mm.
whatever pro anything other than we want this party to win instead of that party to win. Where South Africa differs is I don't think it is. I do think we do actually have an ideological media. I think we have a media that is very strongly um, ideologically partisan, not just in terms of party affiliation. So
Mm.
where they are critical of the government, it'll be because the government isn't sufficiently left wing, or it's not being effectively left wing. So it's a case of we all know where we want to go, and if we're going to criticize the government, it's because they're not going far enough, or they're not using the right route to get there. But there is a very clear, to me at least, ideological bias in the South African media, which does make it different from, I'd say, the American media.
Mm. Yeah, and I mean, to just add on that, you alluded to this, but it's a principled ideology, and if it's principled, it means that it's all the more difficult to dislodge. And this is kind of no secret, but whenever I kind of engage with representatives of the Democratic Alliance, I always make a point of telling them to please stop complaining about the media. I mean, we're complaining about the media, so that's fine, but the way they do it is to say that, my goodness, they are reporting on us negatively. They must just start reporting on us fairly. It's like, listen, banish the thought. Like, this is not going to happen. You're coming up against people who don't just oppose your ideology for kind of to the degree that the DA has an ideology. But these people, I mean, I would go as far as to say that their ideology demands that they hate you. I mean, it's an imperative. You must be wrong just because of who you are. Historically, you represent capitalism in this country. You represent kind of gradual ending of apartheid, as opposed to the revolutionary kind of model of the ANC. You are tainted necessarily. The mainstream press is not going to come to your assistance. And Morné, the point about them being ideological, I mean, that's an important one. The fantasy that they will kind of just realize, oh my goodness, I'm being unfair, let me stop being unfair. That's not how it works. This is not a sense, and then Nicholas was saying this earlier. They do not think, oh good, I'm gonna lie to the public now and kind of get them. Like, they think that this is all real and this is all true. And that is why something like the rational standard is so important. And we're not the only ones doing this. certainly not around the world, but also not in South Africa. It is important for us to put the pressure on to say, listen, News 24, listen, Daily Maverick, listen, Sunday Times. You are allowed to have biases. There is nothing wrong with you having an ideology. It is fine. It is good even for your readers to understand what is happening. It is good for you to say that you have a belief system. The key thing is you must say so. You must lay out your cards. Otherwise, then you are in fact doing something wrong. Um, and yeah, I think that will just ultimately lead to a more informed public. Um, and yeah, I mean, I guess your general South African will tend to be pro-government. We haven't had a civil war in this country. Certainly during COVID, you got the sense that our perspective was a minority one. Uh, we really came up against the Karens in this country. And yes, that will tend to be what people prefer. They want to read about how the government is flattening the curve. They want to read about all the good things the Minister of Health is doing, and then they will know, yes, the mouthpieces of statism are these publications, and that's where I'll get my fix, and that is fine. That is fine as long as that is just clear. And yes, hopefully there's many more like Rational Standard that are come about. I remember Huffington Post South Africa was founded, Nicholas, when we were kind of just getting in our stride as Rational Standard, and I think we wrote an editorial saying this is wonderful. This is a good thing, like a openly progressive kind of center left to left wing kind of publication coming to South Africa. There were a few around on those days, ground up kind of, but there is another one that its name kind of escapes me now.
Daily
That
Vox.
kind of has, yes,
That's
Daily
right.
Vox. I remember. Yeah, they've ceased to exist, I think, since then.
We
But
outlasted them.
yes, we did, and that was good. So Huffington Post was good, and when they closed down, I know a lot of people rejoiced and say, "Oh, good, good, it's gone." I was like, this isn't necessarily a good thing because the journalists who wrote for the left wing, avowedly left wing Daily Vox suddenly became objective, neutral journalists in the mainstream press through some force of magic. It's like, no, this was good. We had them kind of in this publication saying their piece
Corral
from
them.
their perspective. Yeah, and so yeah, that was a loss. So actually, yeah, more power to the left if they want to, and to the woke if they want to establish their own publications in this country. I mean, that would be a good thing for our discourse.
Are you saying we need segregation of news sites?
Absolutely, like no
Yeah.
doubt.
Should they
We need
develop
more
separately?
publication. We need more publications that argue for the disenfranchisement of various groups. Do you guys remember that was
Absolutely.
actually what sank the Huffington Post? Is they ran an article
Yeah,
which said that maybe we should just take the vote away from white men, and
Yeah.
they actually defended that for quite some time and said, no, it's
And these are
pretty standard feminist theory. Actually, it's nothing weird.
yeah. And then they only got angry when they realized that the Shirley Garland was not a miss.
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Which
There's
I mean, can you
some oak
imagine the?
from the
Transphobic, to
East
be
Rand,
honest.
he loves cricket and beer.
Shout out Marius Red.
Yeah. Imagine how
Destroyed them.
confusing
We should
that would
blame
be to
him.
cover today. It's that was before we had sort of the transgender, transition kind of things. I think if the same thing happened to play out today, nobody would know how to cover it because you'd sort of not know. Was it a man pretending to be a woman or yeah? It's way
And
too
he's still
difficult to
white,
piece
so
that
they can
out.
still attack him for that.
Yeah, thank goodness for that.
Yeah, and saying that
Yeah.
something is standard feminist theory is actually very reactionary and transphobic. Because you might be referring to Germaine Greer, or J.K. Rowling,
Yeah.
those well-known bigots who don't
Yeah.
tolerate transgenderism.
Yeah, the TERFs, with the
Yes.
trans exclusionary radical feminists. Yeah, it's no longer as positive
It's
as
not
you
cool, not
think.
good vibes anymore. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, no, I mean you bring up an interesting point, Morné. I remember this. So the first period of the rational standard, we didn't actually have this much wokeness to deal with. I mean,
Mm.
I think this round is going to potentially be. I mean, Fallism was intense. I think it was an intense time, but um, I remember Nikolai Hausammer and I wrote a series of articles. He was one of the co-founders, kind of engaging with standard feminists at the time, who we would have said are woke, and we were told like they were talking about women's rights and kind of discrimination against women. And I remember distinctly one thing that they wrote was saying that air conditioning is sexist against women, and I wrote a response to that. I mean, that is almost inconceivable now because the left, like the term women is a little bit the indeterminate, another nice left wing word. Things are going to be I guess a little bit more interesting this time around with rational standard.
And now you'd
And we have
say air conditioning discriminates against uterus havers.
yeah.
But what about the people who have had estrogen supplements? This is very discriminatory. I think we need to cancel some people here.
So is the rational standard going to take radical positions like we should have women-only bathrooms, for example?
You'd have to tell me what. Oh, sorry, you used a word there, David. I'm not sure I know what it means.
Well, you're not following.
Define what a woman is. I'm getting very uncomfortable right now. We want to be inclusive.
But I think that honestly, we're a broad tent ideology. If an author wants to write something like that, I honestly think that we would have people who would want to write against women-only bathrooms or excluding transgender people from sports. But we'd also publish someone who says, actually, no, there's transgender people have the same rights as other people, and then that's something we would argue on certain merits. Like, for example, there was a recent case talking about transgender people in sports, and this is something which I think is actually far more complicated from both sides than people actually think. So, for example, it used to be that I'd be quite knee-jerk. I'd say, okay, no, it's unfair. There's biological differences. Sports is supposed to be about fairness and stuff. But then people take it too far. For example, with this fencing competition, I'm not sure if you're familiar, but there was this fencing athlete woman who declined to duel against a transgender opponent, male transition to female, as citing how it's unfair. And everyone was calling her very brave. A conservative organization gave her $5,000. What they neglected to mention is the competition was co-ed. She was fighting against actual full biological men. And the transgender individual came 24th. So it wasn't even. So this, and it reminds me of the during the Olympics with the where they claimed that kind of an almost Caster Semenya situation, that the one female boxer had too much testosterone or whatever, and the Italian boxer was like, no, it's unfair and all that stuff. And then we actually found out that that story comes from Russian propaganda because the Russians lost against them, and then also that boxer that was apparently almost a male and was apparently so unfair didn't even do that well. They're quite a middling boxer. So it's this way actually what I mentioned earlier is that we are at peak wokeism, but as things are a cycle, and I remember discussing this even when I was in high school, saying that the left is going to get to the point where they piss off everyone so much that we end up going too far in that direction. And that is what we're already seeing. We're seeing in America how affirmative action, which I think affirmative action is terrible, people need to be hired on merit, but how affirmative action programs have led to the Trump administration actually firing people who did deserve their jobs, but they just happen to be female of a minority race, even to the point where they're deleting archived photos of African American servicemen, where they censored photos of the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they've claimed because it contains the word gay. And and that's where the woke right is. They honestly, I think they're probably worse I think their cancel culture is worse than the woke. Because I think the woke, they could control their platforms. They had their own platform, but you could always go and do your own platforms. And they were very good at shouting at people, and they were very good at being rude. They would heckle you all the time. But I think that the woke right are much more dangerous. And I think we've seen this historically, that the communists that almost took over Germany in the 1920s, but then they were fought by the Freikorps and all those nationalist groups. The communists were evil; they were terrible. But we saw what happened when those reactionary groups that formed as a response to them. And I think that's another thing the Rational Stand needs to be prepared for as well, is that we're not only fighting peak woke leftism, we're going to be fighting the beginnings of a resurgent woke rightery.
Yeah. The thing with the right is that it's generally a lot less pretentious. The left tends to want to go through various kind of filters to get to what they want, whereas the right, and I mean this is both a strength that I think sometimes needs to kind of come out, but it's very much a threat and a kind of a problem for liberals. The right is a fist that kind of just goes for what it wants, and whereas the left has been good at weaponizing kind of ironically kind of capitalism against the things that they oppose, so they get the private sector to cancel people, and they've tended to avoid using the state really as a bludgeoning against free expression. The right, I think, seems to have a far greater appetite to use state power as a means to uh, kind of ban certain books from schools, to kind of change certain communications legislation in the US as well to kind of achieve what they want, and very much use the power of the state. You had Ron DeSantis in Florida, and I think he has his pluses and his minuses, but we're big decentralists, and Ron DeSantis took away Disney World's kind of charter that they had to govern their own properties, almost as kind of a charter city, a charter town. And he said, no, you're a bunch of woke, so sorry, you're not going to have that authority anymore. And we would say, no, you're right about how bad Disney World is, but that doesn't mean you get to like we want more decentralization. We want them to be able to have their own little echo chamber there, and we don't want to use the power of the state against them. But yeah, I mean, guys, this has been a very good conversation, and I think we're all very excited about the Rational Standard. We are over time, but I see we have 24 live watchers now. It's our peak, so thank you to all everyone watching. I just want to give everyone a chance to kind of give any final thoughts before we end off. So, Nicholas, let's start with you.
So we are open to submissions, and we would love to receive your articles. There is a submissions tab on the website. You can also just email us at editor@rationalstandard.com.
Yeah, and then I'd just say we're still going to be producing excellent content in other media platforms. So we'll be continuing to feature our writers and associates in other platforms, but this is going to be really like a core focus for us. And yeah, the idea is to also create an outlet for ourselves to have a bit more range in terms of the ideas that we engage with. But for FMF institutional positions, media statements, you can go to our normal FMF website. But yeah, really looking forward to engaging with some interesting ideas on rationalstandard.com.
Yeah. No, I think it was Albert Camus who said that each work of art is a sort of rebellion against the society, because you feel you have to change something. You feel you have to create something new that doesn't exist at the moment. So I'd just like to invite everybody to take part in the sort of the rational rebellion. Rebel against all these various forces that have almost aligned against the common man and the common woman. But just know that there is a refuge. The world feels chaotic, but we've got plenty of new structures coming up, and if you want those structures to succeed, then you have to make sure that you support them.
Yeah, no, I want to echo that from Morné. There will be opportunities for you to contribute financially to the Rational Standard, and when those do arise, please consider it. We are doing this now as a labor, not just of love, but really of necessity, of kind of something that we really need in the discourse. So we are doing it out of our pockets, but that is not sustainable in any long-term sense without the public, and not everyone, but those who find value and from the product to open their wallets. And of course, as Nicholas said, to also write for the rational standard, provided it kind of satisfies that very basic foundation of a preference for freedom. It will be most welcome in our publication, and of course, provided you are able to write coherent English. But yeah, that is it for today. Please remember to like this video. Please remember to share with your networks, on Facebook, on X, and on any other platforms. And if you're on Substack, please restack and like our content on Substack. That really does help us a lot. And please subscribe to this channel as well. All of our Rational Standard podcasts will be on the Rational Standard website, and all the archived material is already there. So we encourage you to check that out. But do please subscribe to this channel to get the content immediately. And yeah, that's it. That's another week behind us, and we will see all or most of you next week, Friday. Have a good one. Cheerio.
Cheers, everyone. Bye.
Cheers.